about it too much right now. All right. Now, how about connecting? How about connecting to these? Well, that is actually going to be done just by going back to the primary there and clicking connect. Okay, so I'm looking at my file share. I can create directories. Let's say new. Very imaginative here. Create another directory maybe for images. At any point, we can go in and we can take, again, manual snapshots. Okay. And so when I see that created, I'm going to go in and I see that that one has that. Notice here the snapshots actually have a connect button as well. So you are able to connect to the current file share if you would like, or you are able to connect to the snapshots. But anytime that you hit connect, you may be a bit surprised as to what comes up, okay? Because it's not actually connecting you, it's generating the PowerShell commands that you would use to connect. So first things first, Windows versus Linux versus Mac, and it's going to be done on each one differently. So it's actually giving you the commands and do this, all right? In Windows, you do get the idea of a drive letter, and then we can control the authentication method as well. It's going to authenticate based on a storage account key by default. You do have the ability of having identity-based access if it's turned on for the storage account. Okay, and that would be actually back in the storage account and access control. We'd have to set that up. So I'm just going to do the storage account key, and they say this is really only appropriate for admin access because it's not giving you any per user access to these file shares. All you're really doing is running this script. And what this script is doing is making sure that port 445 is not blocked. This is something that we do run into. You could also just do test net connection, and then the location, that's all they're really doing. Computer name is the name of your storage, right? So computer name AZ104PL storage, I believe is what I called it. .file, .core, .windows, .net. Again, files, tables, blobs, it depends on what you're doing. And then we're not just testing, can we connect to it? We're saying, can we connect via SMB? A lot of ISPs are blocking this. And a lot of us are going, oh, who knew? Didn't realize that was going to be blocked. Now, I'm actually running this from a VM within Azure. So that's a little bit different. But you definitely want to do the test. Well, that script that I copied is simply running that test and storing the result in this variable. And then if the result is succeeded, then it goes on to command to add that storage key and then to mount a new drive with the Z letter file system. We're mounting it here and then persistent. So I'm just going to hit enter. Because I know it was successful, it's going to go ahead and add the credential and it's going to tell me that it is now set up as my Z drive, right? So if I just go here to this PC, I now have a network location that is my Z drive that I can double click and access. Okay. And I can store files there, manually copy them. That is going to be a persistent drive mapping. So this is all fine and dandy with a couple of little caveats. And the one is you have to know for sure that users are going to be in a location that has port 445 open. All right. And that right there is enough to where I don't see this being used that much in the real world for client level access, okay? Because you've got that little caveat. And then the second is the identity-based management, being able to manage based on a particular identity. I know it says that we can go and do that. It's a little bit tedious to set up. And so we don't see a lot of people using this. I see people mainly using Azure file shares for storage that's accessible from within Azure VMs like we just did here. And I might do it on a server and then mount the drive. And so, yeah, it's being stored in Azure file storage. Clients are accessing it through that server as they would a normal file share. So just my 2 cents. I mean, that's the demo is just to go in and create it. And that's pretty easy to do and then connect to it. We can see exactly how that is done. But we need to understand sort of the real world implementations of this as well. Now, Azure File Sync is a little bit different because this gives us the ability to centralize an organization's file shares while still having that on-premises file server. It basically just turns the Windows Server on-prem into a quick cache of the Azure file share. So this one is actually a little bit newer in comparison to the others. And so this would work and be a good use for Azure file shares. Scenarios that it supports or benefits that we find, lift and shift, the ability to move applications that require access between Azure and an on-prem system very quickly, the ability to support file archiving. So only recently accessed data is going to be on the local server. So any non-used data gets automatically moved. It's referred to as cloud tiering. Now that's an optional feature, but you can go in and configure it in the settings. Backup and disaster recovery. So once file sync is implemented, then you'd have Azure Backup that would be backing up all the on-prem data, and you'd be able to restore that very quickly. And then we could also have support for branch offices. Branch offices may need to back up files, or maybe they need to set up a new server that'll connect to Azure storage and provide them with an on-premises cache. So, those are some of the features and benefits of Azure File Sync. Let's talk about some of the terminology. This is definitely something that you'll want to know for the exam. So the different components of the Azure File Sync solution are the Storage Sync Service. That's essentially the top level resource for this solution. The Storage Sync Service resource is a peer of the Storage Account resource. And so that means it gets deployed into resource groups, and it is used then to create sync relationships. A sync group is going to define the sync topology for a particular set of files. So within the group, we'll have endpoints, and those endpoints are kept in sync with one another. The endpoint could just be the on-premise server and then the file share, or it could be additional branch offices. The registered server object represents a trust relationship between your server and the storage sync service in the cloud. The Azure File Sync agent is something you would download on the Windows server to be synced with the file share. And it's got a couple of main components, a couple services, and then some PowerShell management commandlets as well. Then we have server endpoint that is a specific location on a registered server. So we've got the storage sync service at the cloud. We've got the sync group that defines endpoints. You register your server, you install the Azure File Sync agent on it, and configure it and then a server endpoint, would be configured as a particular folder, not the server as a whole, but the sync directory or whatever it is. And then the cloud endpoint is your file share that's part of your sync group. So hopefully you can see kind of how all those things work together to provide this functionality. In this demonstration, we're going to look at the Azure File Sync service. As we've talked about, this service is basically used to turn Windows servers either on-prem or in Azure, but usually on-prem as sort of a high-speed cache of files that are frequently accessed but are actually stored in Azure storage. So kind of a cool option for distributing data, especially to branch offices and things like that. I've already got the portal open to deploy Azure File Sync. All you do need to type in there, though, is Azure File Sync. If you do that, then over here you'll see in the marketplace Azure File Sync, and you'll also see all of the documentations and tutorials and things that you would need. Okay, so we have that selected, and it's just going to walk us kind of through the creation of this. So first, the subscription, the resource group that we want to use. I'm going to use my PL test resource group. The name for your storage sync service, and this just kind of depends on what you want to do. I'm just going to call it storage sync 1, the region that you're in, and that's about it here initially for deploying the storage sync service. We just hit review and create. It'll check for any errors, but it didn't really ask us very much, right? We could have added some metadata tags, but other than that, not much else for it to request from you. So once that is done, then the next step would be to prepare a Windows server to use with Azure File Sync. Okay, and so there are certain steps that we have to do. It looked like it finished its review there. We'll go ahead and hit create. Now, the stuff that you need to do on your server, it's not really high-end stuff. We need to go into Server Manager, and I mean, most likely the server is already going to be a member of a domain, a file server, have things set up on it. But we need to at least temporarily make sure that we've got the IE enhanced security configuration turned off, and then we also need to make sure that we have the latest version of PowerShell. Okay? And so you can just open up PowerShell and then use the system variable PS version table. That'll show us. So 5.1, that is actually not the latest edition, but it's pretty close. And I think that is going to suffice for us. So let's go back here. We can see that it is currently in progress, so we'll wait till that finishes, and then we can move forward. Okay, now the deployment is complete, and we will go to resource here and get this out of here. Okay, so now there's our storage sync service. The next step would be to install the Azure File Sync agent. It's just a downloadable package that allows a Windows server to be synced with an Azure file share. We just need to basically go out and get that, and then we will actually need to register the service. Well, while that's just taking its sweet time, we're going to go and just type in Azure File Sync Agent. Because as I said, it's a downloadable file. Now this is going to take us to all sorts of things, and this is really what I want, is just to go download it. Now this is done on the server. I did create an additional virtual machine. This is running Windows Server 2016. This is going to be our sample file server. Okay, and so then we'll just grab that for the appropriate version. So it works with 2012 R2, 2016, and 2019. We'll download it and click open to do the install. They highly suggest that you just leave everything default here, that you don't change anything. Not exactly sure on the reasoning behind that, but that is the recommendation. Okay, we can accept the license terms. We're installing Azure File Sync, default path, hit next. If we need proxy settings to get to the internet, then we'll have to put those in here. I have to specify whether we want to use updates and do automatic updates on that storage sync agent, which is a good idea as well. So once this is done, then we would be going back to the storage sync section and registering our server. Okay, so that's complete. We'll hit finish, and we'll go back over here. All right, now it finally refreshed itself. There are various settings in here, but I mean, the first thing that you need to do is basically create a sync group. And as we talked about, sync group is just defining the topology for a particular set of files. A registered server, actually that's the first thing we need to do. Registered server is your link, your trust relationship between the storage sync service, and that particular server. We will go to registered servers. This is a relatively new feature. I don't recall if I mentioned that or not. Relatively new feature, and one that I personally have not seen out in the wild as of yet. Seems like a logical idea, but it's not one that I have encountered in a real world scenario. So definitely one though that you want to know about for the test, albeit that you really just need kind of the high level order of operations here. All right. So you go to registered server. This would have been the other link to download and install. And then after finishing the install, we will use the server registration. So that actually opened up for me. I didn't notice that. So we'll let that go. And then it just says, okay, we're signing in to Azure, whether you're signing in as a CSP, a cloud solution provider. So I'm just going to have to put in my credentials here. That'll associate me with this particular tenant. So I'll see the subscriptions I can choose a resource group. Again, this is not really that big of a deal because we're doing this, as an admin. We're setting this up, and then the storage sync service in that particular resource group. That's it. Click register, and then at least that part of this is done. Okay, then I would be going in and creating a sync group and defining the topology for a particular set of files. All right, and so that is complete. It says you can now use PowerShell or the Azure portal to configure your sync. So I can go in here and hit refresh, and upon doing so, even though everything is taking very long, it should show me my registered server. So there's a server. It lists the operating system when it was last seen, shows it as being online, and then of course you can select that server. You can go in here, you can just see the status, you can unregister the server. We've got various other options, but I hesitate to click on them. So we have networks, we have locks where you cannot make changes to it. On the server itself, you've got an Azure File Sync here and the Azure File Sync Updater. But this isn't really where you would go to do anything. That's just simply going to configure updates. Make sure that you have got the latest version. So we're going to need to go in here and we're going to need to next really create that sync group. Okay, so we see that there are no sync groups. We would just select plus on the sync group. We'll give it a particular name. I'm just going to call it Azure File Share, but obviously you want to be a little bit more explicit. We're going to set up the subscription, and then we have to select the storage account that contains the file share. So you do need to be in the same resource group, in the same region. You saw that it was only showing me the East regions, which is possibly why my other one was not showing up. It'll create it, okay? And it's basically, you're just pointing to a file share in Azure that you want this server to, at some point, synchronize with. After that, really everything's kind of behind the scenes because the server will have a cache of everything that's in that file share in Azure. You can make it available to users on the local network, right? They can connect and then it'll use the tiering to make sure that the frequently accessed data is always cached. So high-speed access for offices, high-speed access for branches, content distribution. You can create as many sync groups as you want. And then this process, you can see it's creating these cloud endpoints, and you'll be able to give access to those shares to users. So kind of a cool service, definitely one that you want to know for the exam. And I think that's going to complete the demonstration here on configuring Azure File Sync.